All right, so welcome to our deep dive today.
Yeah.
We're going to try to untangle this whole Ukraine situation.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially with the change in the U.S. administration.
Yeah.
What's so interesting right now is we've got these two articles, one from the New York Times and one from Time Magazine.
Right.
Both from January 19th, 2025.
Okay.
And they kind of paint an interesting picture of what a potential deal with Russia might actually look like under this new Trump presidency.
It's a complicated situation for sure.
Yeah.
You know, we're coming out of the Biden era.
Right.
And support for Ukraine was, well, how do we say this? It was a bit open-ended.
Yeah, as long as it takes was the phrase.
Yeah.
But what does that really mean?
Exactly.
In practice.
Yeah.
The Time article really dives into Biden's whole strategy and highlights these three core objectives he had.
Exactly. Survival of Ukraine as a sovereign democratic state.
Right.
Maintaining that united Western front. And of course, avoiding a direct clash between NATO and Russia.
Right.
But what really stood out to me was how deliberately vague that as long as it takes support really was. Yeah. Especially when it came to...
specific territorial goals.
Yeah, like what did they actually want for Ukraine?
Yeah. The Time piece quotes Eric Green, who served on Biden's National Security Council.
Okay.
And he says, they purposely avoided defining those territorial objectives.
It makes you wonder why.
Yeah.
Well, the article gives us a little insight into that.
Okay.
It seems the administration believed that Ukraine, even with all that Western support, wouldn't actually be able to fully regain the territory lost to Russia.
So basically, they were working under the assumption that Ukraine would have to give up some land as part of any future peace deal. It's not really a surprise that Zelenskyy wasn't too thrilled about that.
No, not at all. His frustration is really clear.
Yeah.
In that Time article, he wants total victory.
While Biden was aiming for, you know, a more limited success.
Yeah.
Just Ukraine's survival.
Right.
It shows a real tension between those two leaders and their goals.
And we can't forget how much aid the U.S. has already given to Ukraine.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
The article mentions something like $183 billion.
Wow.
You'd think that would, you know, buy a little bit of goodwill, but...
Well, it's not just about the money, is it?
Right.
Zelenskyy feels like it wasn't enough, especially when it comes to pushing harder on sanctions against Russia.
Right.
And, you know, advocating for Ukraine's NATO membership.
Right.
He sees joining NATO as the only real guarantee of security against future Russian aggression.
But that's the thing. The article suggests that a deal under Trump might mean Ukraine would have to accept the loss of those occupied territories in exchange for a ceasefire.
And the real challenge there is how do you make sure Russia doesn't just regroup and invade again?
Right. The New York Times article quotes Jake Sullivan,
Biden's national security advisor, saying that they've been setting up these security architectures to prevent that.
Security architectures, it sounds.
It sounds kind of vague.
Yeah, what does that actually mean in practical terms?
Yeah.
Well, think of it as like a multi-layered system of deterrence.
Okay.
It could involve continued U.S. military aid, intelligence sharing, and potentially even giving Ukraine the okay to strike Russian territory near the border.
Interesting.
It's a risky move for sure.
Yeah.
But the goal is to maintain that pressure on Russia.
But is that enough to deter Putin?
Well, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Zelenskyy seems pretty skeptical.
Yeah.
He's referencing that 1994 security agreement that ultimately failed to protect Ukraine.
Yeah. He feels like he's been down this road before.
Yeah.
And it didn't really end well.
It's understandable why he's wary.
Yeah.
He sees NATO membership as like the only real ironclad guarantee. But realistically, that's not really on the table right now.
So we have this really interesting dynamic.
Yeah.
Zelenskyy wants victory. He wants NATO membership.
Right.
But the reality on the ground, as it's presented in these articles, seems to point toward a deal where Ukraine loses land and has to rely on security guarantees.
Right.
That might not be enough to really deter future aggression.
And this brings us to another layer of complexity.
Okay.
The potential for a deal is even more complicated by those internal divisions within the Republican Party.
Yeah, the New York Times article mentions Trump's own Vice President, J.D. Vance, as someone who's very critical of continued U.S. military support for Ukraine.
Yeah.
So how might that affect the chances of a deal actually happening?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And we're going to explore that more in the next part of our deep dive.
We'll be back in a flash. Okay, so we're back and ready to dig a little deeper into this potential Ukraine deal.
Right.
You mentioned J.D. Vance's opposition to the continued military aid. What's the bigger picture there?
Well, the New York Times article points out that Vance represents a growing faction within the Republican Party that are skeptical of the continued U.S. involvement in Ukraine.
Yeah.
They're saying the U.S. needs to prioritize its own interests first and limit its commitments overseas.
Okay, so how might that then influence Trump's approach to a deal?
It could push him towards a faster resolution, even if it means making concessions that might not be good for Ukraine in the long run.
Right.
He has to balance wanting a deal with the potential backlash from his own party.
Right.
If it seems like Russia's getting too much out of it.
It's a really tough balancing act.
Yeah, it is.
Especially when you think about the fact that Russia probably wants a much bigger agreement.
Oh, absolutely.
The article mentions them pushing for the U.S. to, completely pull back its military presence from Europe.
That's been a goal of theirs for a long time.
Yeah.
But it seems unlikely that any U.S. president, even Trump, would go for something that big.
Right.
It would be a huge shift in the balance of global power.
So let's play devil's advocate for a second.
Okay.
What if Trump actually manages to strike a deal?
Yeah.
What are some potential pitfalls?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is making sure that the peace lasts.
Right.
As we've been talking about. Just stopping fighting where it is doesn't fix the problems that caused the invasion to begin with.
Right. The New York Times article mentions the Korean War.
Yeah.
Using that as an analogy.
Right. A ceasefire might stop the fighting right now.
Right.
But it could also create a frozen conflict.
Yeah.
With this constant threat that it could all start up again.
And if Russia keeps control of those territories in eastern Ukraine, that gives them a base to maybe launch more attacks in the future.
Exactly.
So how do you stop that from happening? The article mentions a European peacekeeping force.
Yeah.
What are the chances of that actually working?
Well, it's come up before.
Okay.
But the details are still fuzzy. Who's going to provide troops?
Yeah.
What would their mission be? Would they actually have the power and the political will to stop Russia if they try something again?
It feels like a lot of questions without any easy answers.
Yeah. And then there's also the issue of enforcement.
Okay.
How do you actually make sure Russia follows the rules of any agreement?
Yeah. Zelensky's already said he doesn't trust any security guarantees that don't include NATO membership.
He feels burned by that 1994 agreement.
Rightfully so.
And the Time article quotes him saying, we cannot make the same mistake twice.
Yeah.
He's adamant that keeping Ukraine safe is the same as keeping Europe safe. And that if Russia takes Ukraine, they won't stop there.
That's a scary thought.
It is.
So we have this incredibly delicate situation.
Yeah.
A potential deal that hinges on a ceasefire that might not even hold security guarantees. That might not be believable.
Yeah.
And this deep mistrust between everyone involved.
And let's not forget the wild card.
Oh, right.
Trump.
Yeah.
He's famous for being unpredictable.
Yeah.
And being willing to make these sudden dramatic changes in policy.
So that makes it even harder to know what's going to happen.
Absolutely.
But the stakes are huge.
Oh, yeah.
Not just for Ukraine and Russia, but for the whole world.
Right. The outcome of this conflict will affect global politics for decades.
Okay, so we've covered Ukraine really thoroughly.
We have.
But these articles also paint a kind of worrying picture of Iran.
They do.
So let's shift gears and talk about that.
Yeah, the situation in Iran is probably even more volatile than in Ukraine.
Yeah, the New York Times article describes it as a country that's at a crossroads.
Okay.
Facing problems both at home and from other countries.
Right.
The article says Iran is arguably at its weakest point in recent history. They've lost important allies.
Yeah.
Their influence in the Middle East has gone down.
Right.
And their economy is struggling.
Yeah, because of those sanctions.
And we can't forget about that Israeli missile strike back in October.
Oh, right.
Which really damaged Iran's air defenses.
Yeah.
Including those protecting their nuclear sites.
So you're thinking a weaker Iran might be more willing to negotiate?
Yeah.
Well, the New York Times article suggests it's more complicated than that.
Okay.
Iran's new president, Masoud Pezeshkian, he's said he's interested in reviving the nuclear deal.
Okay.
But the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps seems to be going in the opposite direction.
So they're doing their own thing.
Yeah, the article says they're increasing production of near bomb-grade uranium.
Wow.
And they're taking other steps
okay.
that suggest they're getting closer to actually having a nuclear weapon.
It's like they're playing a really dangerous game.
Yeah.
Testing how far they can push the West.
Exactly.
And where does Trump fit into all this?
Well, he's been talking tough.
Okay.
As you'd expect.
Mm-hmm.
The Times article mentions him bringing back his maximum pressure campaign against Iran.
Right.
And he's even hinted at the possibility of military action.
It's like what he did with North Korea in 2017.
Right.
Lots of big talk and threats.
And then he switched to diplomacy.
Right. And those beautiful letters with Kim Jong-un.
Right. But we all know how that turned out.
Yeah.
Those letters didn't really accomplish much.
Right.
And North Korea just kept developing its nuclear program.
So are we about to see another one of Trump's foreign policy roller coasters?
Maybe.
This time with Iran?
It's definitely possible.
All right.
But there's another important player in this situation.
Who's that?
Israel.
Right. The article says that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu might see this as a chance to do something decisive against Iran's nuclear facilities.
With Iran's defenses weakened, Netanyahu might be tempted to launch a preemptive strike.
Okay.
Arguing that Iran is vulnerable. Right.
And can't really retaliate effectively.
So this is where Trump has a big decision to make.
Yeah.
Does he try to hold back Israel? Or does he risk getting pulled into another conflict in the Middle East?
It's a tough call.
Right at the very beginning of his presidency.
It could have huge consequences.
Okay, so we've got Ukraine and Iran on the table.
Right.
What about China?
Yes, the China challenge.
Yeah.
This one's complicated.
Yeah.
It involves everything from trade disagreements to the future of Taiwan to this growing partnership between China and Russia.
The New York Times piece focuses on something that seems kind of small at first. TikTok.
Oh, yeah. I remember all the controversy about that app.
Right, during Trump's first term.
Yeah.
And all his attempts to make its Chinese owners sell it.
Right. And now it seems like Trump himself has started using the app for his campaign.
For this latest election.
Yeah. But the Times article suggests that his decision about what to do with TikTok
will be a test of how he's going to deal with Chinese President Xi Jinping.
It's like a mini version of the whole U.S.-China relationship.
Yeah.
Seems small.
Right.
But it could have a lot of symbolic meaning.
Exactly.
And set the tone for future interactions.
And then there's the big issue that everyone's thinking about.
Taiwan.
Yeah.
The article mentions that Taiwan was supposed to be the first big problem with China for the new Trump administration.
Okay.
But it seems like TikTok has taken its place for now.
But Taiwan's still there.
Yeah.
It's still a potential crisis waiting to happen.
Right.
And China's been very clear. They see Taiwan as part of their territory.
The Times article also talks about this new China-Russia partnership as a major change in global politics.
Yeah, one that could completely reshape the world.
And it's a partnership that's based on their shared interests and a common enemy.
The United States.
The article points out that this partnership has effects on everything. From the possibility of a new Cold War to the chance of them working together militarily and in cyberspace.
Against the West.
The Biden administration knew this was happening.
Yeah.
They were even working on a secret strategy to counter this growing alliance between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea.
But it seems like Trump's people are taking a more aggressive stance.
Okay.
The article quotes his pick for Secretary of State Senator Marco Rubio as saying that China is the most potent and dangerous near-peer adversary this nation has ever faced.
So we don't know exactly what Trump's China policy will be.
Right.
But it's probably safe to say it'll be more confrontational.
Yeah, definitely more than during his first term.
And then there's artificial intelligence.
Right.
Which the Times article says is a key area of competition between the U.S. and China.
It's a race to be the most technologically advanced.
Yeah.
And it has huge implications.
Absolutely.
For things like economic power, military strength, and even the future of humanity.
The article talks about how the Biden administration tried to stop China from getting advanced chips and the equipment to make them.
Right.
Hoping to keep the U.S. ahead.
But Trump's surrounded by tech people.
Right.
Who don't like those restrictions, so he might go in a different direction.
A tough choice.
It is.
Does he focus on national security or the economic benefits of being closer to China?
Yeah. In the world of AI?
Another tough decision with no easy answers.
Right.
So as we finish this part of our deep dive, we're left with a world facing some really serious challenges and uncertain outcomes.
Absolutely.
From the war in Ukraine to the nuclear tensions with Iran to this growing competition with China.
Yeah.
The incoming Trump administration is walking into a really difficult global situation.
And with Trump, you never know what to expect.
That's true.
It's anyone's guess how these challenges are going to play out.
We'll be back in a moment to talk about the Middle East and wrap up this deep dive. Okay, so we're back for the last part of this deep dive. And we've covered some pretty heavy stuff, Ukraine, Iran, China.
Right.
All big problems for the new Trump administration. But let's maybe try to end on a more positive note.
Okay.
Let's talk about the Middle East.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some hope there.
Well, the New York Times article suggests that Trump might see the Middle East as a chance to cement his legacy, maybe even win that Nobel Peace Prize he seems to want so badly.
Wow, that would be something, wouldn't it?
It would.
So where's this optimism coming from?
Well, it all starts with the 2020 Abraham Accords.
Okay.
Remember when Israel normalized relations with the UAE and Bahrain?
Right. That was a big achievement for Trump.
It was.
During his first term.
Exactly. And the article suggests that the Biden administration was actually working on expanding those accords.
Okay.
Maybe even getting Saudi Arabia involved.
That would be huge.
It would.
The Times article quotes Antony Blinken, Biden's Secretary of State.
Right.
Saying he was close to a deal with the Saudis. But then Hamas launched that attack on Israel.
Right back in October 2023.
Yeah.
And Blinken thinks the attack was deliberately timed to stop any chance of Israel and Saudi Arabia making peace.
So now that Trump's back in the White House, could this bigger Middle East peace agreement be back on the table?
It could be.
The
Times article outlines a possible scenario.
Okay.
Trump could try to finalize that deal with Saudi Arabia, help set up a new Lebanese government that can control Hezbollah, and even try to rebuild Syria.
That's a lot to do even for someone like Trump.
It is.
Who loves making deals.
He would definitely need to be very careful.
Yeah.
Balancing everyone's interests and dealing with all those historical disagreements.
And we can't forget about the potential problems within Trump's own team.
Oh, right. The article mentions Mike Huckabee.
Okay.
His choice for ambassador to Israel.
Yeah.
He's against a two-state solution. Okay.
And supports those Israeli settlements in the West Bank.
So even if there's a chance for progress, it's not going to be easy.
It's never easy in the Middle East, is it?
It seems like every foreign policy challenge Trump's facing requires this really delicate balancing act, weighing different interests, navigating all these alliances and rivalries.
That's global politics.
Yeah, there are almost never any easy solutions.
Very rarely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we're left with a sense of both possibility and uncertainty.
Yeah.
The new Trump administration is facing a world full of challenges, from that ongoing war in Ukraine to Iran's nuclear ambitions and this growing China-Russia partnership.
But even with all that complexity, there are some reasons to be hopeful, especially in the Middle East. Maybe expanding those Abraham Accords could actually lead to more stability and cooperation.
It will be interesting to see how Trump handles everything.
Oh, yeah, for sure. He's definitely known for shaking things up.
Absolutely.
Only time will tell what his foreign policy legacy will be.
Right.
And speaking of legacies, that brings us to the end of our deep dive for today.
It's been a really fascinating discussion.
I agree it has.
Exploring all these complicated issues with you.
I've enjoyed it too, and to our listener.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
We hope you found it informative.
I'm Robert.
And I'm Linda.
See you next time.